Most monarchies in fantasy are boring. There's usually a king and he rules stuff. There might be a few nobles who have a say in some things. They either act as advisors to the king or as evil schemers to fault the king's rule. These monarchies tend to be aesthetically feudalist. The king's power and his legitimacy is derived from one or multiple gods, or just some weird system of honor that was built upon for generations. But monarchies can be much more than the usual slop. An interesting government can bring tension and conflict to your story that goes beyond the usual court scheming and the occasional noble revolt you see in a lot of fantasy. And in this video, I'll show you how to create these type of monarchies suited for your worlds and your story's needs for conflict. For that, I've got 3 questions you can ask yourself when creating a monarchy. First, think about what kind of monarchy fits your setting and culture the most. For most of medieval fantasy, a feudalistic monarchy where the king is the sovereign of a proto-state bound by nothing but contracts and agreements between nobles makes the most sense. But I've got a video on feudal kingdoms already if you want to know more about feudalism and how to integrate feudalism into your world. So check out that after watching this video. 2 more well-known forms of monarchies are absolute monarchies and constitutional monarchies. The former is most well known in connection to Louis XIV, the Sun King of France, whose father, with the help of Cardinal Richelieu, concentrated a lot of power within France onto the crown. Louis XIV further cemented the crown's power by replacing the nobles within the different ministries of France with a more meritocratic system set up by the king himself. The nobles who just lost a civil war and were pulled to the court in Versailles, where they were allowed to party all day, didn't care that much in the end. Absolute monarchies aren't as absolute as you might think, however. No king rules alone. The ministers Louis XIV set up held a lot of power within France, and Louis was absolute in his rule because he put in a lot of good effort for them not to overstep their boundaries. And those who did overstep their boundaries were axed. While absolute monarchies existed outside of Europe in one form or another for longer than Louis XIV, constitutional monarchies are a more recent addition to the list. In Europe, they were a consequence of the same state-building mechanisms that made France become absolutist in the 17th century. But this time in England. These structures existed for quite some time in England, but only after the turmoil of the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, England turned into a constitutional monarchy where the power of the king was curtailed by a larger governing body. But there isn't even necessarily just one king in a country. If religion and magic play a larger role in the daily life of your people, your country might have 2 or more kings, like in the case of Sparta. The Lacedaemonians had 2 kings. One king was the supreme general, the leader of the Spartan army. The other king was the supreme ritualist, the king of the spiritual side of Sparta, as ritual was just as important as defense in the eyes of the people. The split between the church and the state is a very Abrahamic thing. Many monarchs, for example the Emperor of Japan, are primarily spiritual in nature and have the role the Pope had in medieval Europe next to their more worldly duties. And there are many more examples for monarchies, but most of them are influenced by the way they are legitimized. But before getting into that topic, maybe think about leaving a like and subscribe. Maybe even tell me about your monarchies in your setting in the comments. Anyways, legitimacy is the way and the reason people put up with a king and follow them, instead of relying on a more pluralistic form of government. This is the second question on the list. Legitimization of your monarchy. The way the rulership of your monarchy is legitimized might be the easiest way to make it more unique, as it heavily influences question 1. The sociologist Max Weber describes 3 types of political legitimacy in his essay Politics as a Vocation. And these 3 types, of course, apply to kings as much as to other politicians. First, there is traditional legitimacy. Traditional legitimacy is usually the most common form found within monarchies. And the king is the king, because there has always been a king. Many dynasties and houses try to build up such forms of legitimacy to establish themselves as a lasting dynasty. The Habsburg dynasty, for example, forged a bunch of family trees and treaties that claimed that they were direct descendants of Caesar, making them rightful heirs of Charlemagne's crown. This traditional legitimacy usually followed years of charismatic leadership. This form of legitimacy derives from a charismatic leader, a person you follow for personal reasons or loyalty, or it can be out of idealism, the ideas the person represents, making you follow them. These types of government usually have weaker administrative institutions. They lack the foundations of a state, as they usually have to build up these foundations. For that, the charismatic leader's dynasty must be just as charismatic as the leader himself. I think the classic charismatic leaders are Alexander the Great and his Diadochi. Alexander was followed because he won wars. He pushed his people to the edges of the world because he had the charisma of the gods, described to be enveloped by a divine aura. His followers and the later kings of the Diadochi kingdoms followed this type of legitimacy for a long time, except for the Ptolemies, who tried to become traditional early on by adapting to Egyptian culture. But the legitimacy of most other Diadochi kings derived from both their charisma, their well-meaning nature towards their people, and most importantly, by the number of wars they won. A losing king was quickly disposed. Lastly, rational legitimacy, or law-driven legitimacy. The king is the king because it's the law. This type of legitimacy is usually constitutional in nature, and should be the rarest type in most medieval fantasy. Of course, I don't want to keep you from creating a bureaucratic hellhole of a kingdom. Besides of the modern constitutional monarchies, the most well-known rational legitimized monarchy might be the Roman Empire. The Roman Republic was an established state, a mixture of rational and traditional legitimacy that lived on for hundreds of years. Augustus turned this constitution over, made himself princeps, the first citizen, and derived kingly power without being a king by name. Augustus used the frames and boundaries of Roman law to make himself king, or rather emperor. Only later, during the late antiquity, people stopped caring about it and stopped pretending to live in a republic. By the way, divine rule of kings falls into this category as well, I'd say. You can mix and match these forms of legitimacy anyways. You can add new ones. Lastly, think about the people who legitimate the monarchy and the king. His direct followers, especially. His advisors, his vassals, the king's warriors and guards. As I said already, despite the name, no monarch is a lone ruler. Think about how the king's powers are curtailed, even without a constitution. What powers the king might have, and what actions he can do without going too far over the line that might spur rebellions. Think about the interactions between the king and the elites of the country, and how the king remains to have his upper hand, even further beyond legitimacy. The monarchy might be legitimized and kept up as a system, but a single king might be disposed and replaced either by a new dynasty or by one of his siblings. There are several types of kingship in my setting. For example, there's the Magocrator of Basilea, the King of Kings of Tyr, or the Golden King of Tuvaru. Tuvaru is a federation of several polities that is ruled by the Golden King on the continent of Calyria. The federation is relatively well connected and stable, as the federation exists for more than 300 years in one form or another. Unlike in other kingdoms, there was no king who united them all. Originally, the king of Tuvaru was meant as a mediator between all the different polities. He was elected by the assembly to become the military and spiritual leader of the kingdom. The post was usually held by the smaller polities in the Federation, who don't have a lot of personal power. Over time, things changed. The position was more and more often sold off to the highest bidder, who later spent most of the rule paying his countrymen off with gold they usually earned through raids by pillaging parties or during wars against neighboring kingdoms. About 150 years ago, the Mbesa dynasty struck gold, literally. They found rich gold and many arcane crystal deposits within their kingdom and used their newfound wealth to secure the position of king ever since, thus coining the title of Gold King even more. Over the years, the position of king has become more and more secure in the hands of the Mbesas. Their infrastructure projects around the Federation brings back money into their pockets, as well as securing themselves political power in the different areas of the country. At the same time, they set up many institutions to set up their power, secured loyalists, and slowly transformed the elective monarchy into a hereditary one. But many factions within the Federations become more and more unhappy by their more and more secure rule. That's it for today's video, world builders. I hope you liked it. Tell me about your own kingdoms and monarchies in the comments. See ya!